Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Tuesday, 5th of June 2018. And this morning I'm up here on Epsom Downs, and it's unfortunately a rather cool, wet and somewhat misty morning. But I'm here overlooking southwest London, although you can't really see it today because of the mist. But when the skies are clearer, you have a beautiful view here over southwest London and across to Canary Wharf over on the east. Well, I'm here primarily because a little under a year ago, a lot of the residents in this area came up onto the downs in the early hours of the morning of 14th of June last year to observe a tragedy unfolding. And of course that was Grenfell Tower. And nearly a year on, much has come to light. Of course, sadly, there were some reported 72 deaths as a result of that tragedy. It was the occupants of some 23 out of the 129 apartments perished that night. So at this juncture, what do we know? Well, it's believed that the fire was started accidentally on the 4th floor of the apartment block by a fridge freezer. And there have been some suggestions that it was a smart fridge and linked into a smart meter, but that at this juncture is perhaps just conjecture. But the fire started around about 1 o'clock. And in fact, the emergency services report that they first got notified of the fire about 6 minutes before 1 on that fateful morning. Now, over the course of the ensuing 60 plus hours for which the fire raged, and of course it is perhaps significant that the building did not collapse in that time, but over the next 60 hours, there were some 250 firefighters with some 70 fire engines. There was over 100 ambulance crews with, it's acknowledged, some 20 plus ambulances ferrying the affected back and forward to the hospitals. And in addition to that, there was the hazardous response team, the Met Police, the London's Air Ambulance. And, all of this, of course, caught the emergency services unawares. But in general, they responded brilliantly. However, of course, there was one grave failing within the emergency response. And that was any real foresight, any real planning as to what to do in an event like this occurring. And of course, tower fires are not exactly unknown, but it seems that the London Fire Brigade were instructing people to remain in their apartments. And sadly, those who died on the upper floors of Grenfell Tower, sadly, their deaths are very much attributable to the advice given by the London Fire Service. And this is really unforgivable in so many ways, because these apartment blocks have been around since the 1960s. In fact, you can tell a 1960s apartment block because it looks so drab, and that is why the efforts have been made to beautify them, with the cladding that unfortunately ultimately now is proven to have been responsible for spreading the fire so quickly. But the fire brigade and the emergency services clearly did not have a cohesive or coherent plan with which to put in place in the event of such a tragedy unfolding. And obviously there have been numerous inquiries since, but let's just have a look at some of the facts. And the facts are that this was very much an avoidable tragedy. In 2012, £8.7 million was spent on the renovation. And we now know, of course, that an alternative fire-resistant cladding was rejected due to cost. For a nominal additional cost, I believe it was less than like £2 per sheet of the cladding, then the tragedy could have certainly been avoided, or certainly greatly reduced. And the residents of this tower block had previously tried to express their concerns to the local council and to the management team of the apartment block. And you've got to remember that this is in one of the highest dollar residential areas in the UK. This was ostensibly social housing. There were a few apartments in the building that were privately owned, but ostensibly it was social housing. And this was almost something that a lot of the residents just wanted to try and sort of ignore, or hide their eyes as they walked past. And yet the people who resided in these apartment blocks provide essential services, so that those who are earning the outrageous amounts of money can go about their lives without worrying about the basics of life. But those residents who had tried to flag up the concerns, they found themselves ostracised and indeed bullied by the local council and by the Apartment Management Association. And the sort of things that the residents had complained about was believe it or not, there were exposed gas pipes outside the apartments and the inner stairwell. And there was only one stairwell, this central stairwell, whereas, obviously it is now accepted that you need at least two emergency means of egress in the event of a tragedy unfolding. And of course, significantly, there were no sprinklers. And this is something that is truly unforgivable, because after the Lakanal House disaster of 2009, where 6 people lost their lives, there were numerous discussions in Parliament. And in fact, in a 2012 report, the British Automatic Fire Sprinkler Association said that sprinklers could be retrofitted in Grenfell Tower for £1,250 per flat. So the total cost of fitting a sprinkler system in Grenfell Tower would have been £138,000. And in March 2014, the All-Party Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group sent a letter to the then Communities Minister, Stephen Williams, which said, surely, when you already have credible evidence to justify updating the guidance which will lead to the saving of lives, you don't need to wait another 3 years in addition to the 2 already spent since the research findings were updated in order to take action. As there are estimated to be another 4,000 older tower blocks in the UK without automatic sprinkler protection, can we really afford to wait for another tragedy occur before we amend this weakness? That was written in 2014, 3 years before the Grenfell Tower disaster. So it was a tragedy and a disaster waiting to happen, as it seems is Cuadrilla's well site in Lancashire. Now, over the last few months, a number of people, particularly Benjamin Dean and Helen Chunso, have submitted numerous Freedom of Information requests to the emergency services in Lancashire to establish precisely what plans are in place in the event of a major disaster, such as a blowout, occurring at the Preston New Road well site of Cuadrilla. And of course, these were the questions also asked in North Yorkshire. And in fact, the well site at Kirkby Misperton was an absolute disaster waiting to happen. I have never seen such a ram-packed frack pad as we saw at Kirkby Misperton. And fortunately, Clarke the Minister for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, he realised that actually not only was there a problem with the health and safety issues at Kirkby Misperton, but more importantly, of course, Third Energy did not have the financial resilience to be able to continue to operate. And they certainly didn't have the financial capacity to be able to pay for any cleanup operation in the event of a tragedy unfolding. Well, Cuadrilla have now published their accounts, and of course no doubt today they will be bragging all over social media that they are in profit. Well, they're only in profit because Centrica have effectively given them a bung. So without Centrica, then Cuadrilla would be in a very similar situation to that of Third Energy. They would simply be digging the financial hole deeper and deeper. And of course, Third Energy were hoping that Barclays Bank were going to give them another bung to at least give them the opportunity to pretend to be solvent. Well, Cuadrilla are certainly, pretending that they're solvent, despite acknowledging that, they've actually got tax credits built up of some £60 million. So, that's again, of course, is more evidence the fact that these companies have zero intention of actually paying any tax in the UK, and they will simply keep making losses so that they can feed their ill-gotten gains, should they make any, offshore. But more importantly, Cuadrilla have now submitted their application to Greg Clarke to frack at Preston New Road. Yet there are zero emergency plans in place, and over the next few days we will be looking in greater and greater detail as to how and whom is remiss in actually not developing these plans. And consequently, through this broadcast, I am putting Greg Clarke and James Brokenshire on notice that in the event of you signing off Cuadrilla's application to frack at Preston New Road before being absolutely confident that a detailed emergency plan is in place, not just for the well site, but for the wider community, then you will be culpable for another Grenfell Tower type disaster, where we now know that there was ample warning and ample opportunity to take the necessary action to prevent that tragedy occurring. And the Lakanal House disaster of 2009 should have been the wake-up call, but of course you weren't in office then, so we'll ignore that. But you took office, your party took office in 2010, so everything that has transpired since that time is your responsibility. And of course the unconventional gas agenda is absolutely the Tory party responsibility. They are the only political party that is still endorsing this pernicious industry. Every other party has stated that in the event of them coming into office, they will immediately put a ban on unconventional gas exploitation in England. Of course, it's already in place in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in France, and many other countries around the world. But in England, thanks to Lord John Brown buttonholing David Cameron and George Osborne and telling them what an amazing opportunity this is. Of course, he's ridden off into the sunset since then. But this is a David Cameron and George Osborne agenda. It's not a Theresa May agenda. It's not even a Philip Hammond agenda. And it's certainly not a Greg Clarke or James Brokenshire agenda. And yet, you guys, Greg Clarke and James Brokenshire, you are the ones who are on point here. It is your political careers and indeed perhaps your personal liberty that is potentially at stake in the event of a disaster unfolding in Preston New Road or anywhere else for that matter that this industry attempts to establish a footprint. And of course, one should be very, very concerned about Cuadrilla. because their track record to date absolutely sucks. It's appalling. We know that they triggered the seismic events at Priest Hall in 2011. We know that they knew they had damaged the well, and we know that they didn't report it, and they continued to proceed with the frack operation, which led to yet another seismic event. And ultimately, it was only in August of 2011 that Cuadrilla begrudgingly stated that, well, there is a possibility that we were responsible. No, you were responsible. It was your incompetence. And it was the cowboy operation that led to the seismic events and ultimately to the moratorium being put in place. And Ed Davey, the Minister of Energy at the time, wrote to Lord John Brown and basically said, you guys, what makes you think that, we should continue to grant you permission to operate when, you display this level of incompetence and obfuscation by not acknowledging, what had actually transpired. Well, of course, Ed Davey was subsequently removed from his position. But here we are, 7 years on, and yet, basically, nothing's changed. And in fact, of course, earlier this year, Greg Clarke's deputy, Claire Perry, admitted in responses to Sarah Wollaston that basically the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy had not updated its information or research on this industry, on the number of jobs that would be involved, on the amount of water that would be consumed, on the amount of waste that would be produced, and how that waste was going to be disposed of. And what we absolutely now know, thanks to the efforts in particular of Benjamin Dean and Helen Chunso, what we now know is that the emergency services in Lancashire have absolutely no plans in place whatsoever in the event of a disaster occurring, such as a blowout. And, no doubt the industry is going to say, oh, but we have the gold standard regulation in this country. No, we don't. You don't have any regulation in place. And the Freedom of Information request responses prove categorically that, you haven't consulted with the emergency services. The Health and Safety Executive have confirmed that their responsibilities stop at the perimeter of the well site. But unfortunately, in the event of a blowout, the emissions of rogue gases don't stop at the perimeter of the well site. They will leach into the community. And I believe there are at least 3 schools in the area, potentially affecting some 2,500 plus pupils. And Kirkham Grammar School is less than a mile away. So this is a Grenfell Tower disaster waiting to happen in the Blackpool area. And don't think for 1 minute that this doesn't happen on a, unfortunately, rather regular basis. In fact, earlier this year, XTO, which is a subsidiary of Exxon, had their second blowout in 12 months. And this blowout took 3 weeks to cap. And it's estimated that over 1 million cubic feet a day of toxic gases were leaching into the atmosphere with no control. In the US, in many states, there are detailed and comprehensive evacuation plans and emergency procedures in place. And yet here in the UK, a government that's had 7 years at least, 8 if you take from the time they came into office, to prepare for this industry establishing itself in the UK, but there's nothing. And over the next few days, and on Fracking Nightmare on Thursday night, we'll be going into much more detail and exposing the individuals and the organisations that, and of course at government level, who are remiss in addressing this issue. and are simply burying their heads in the proverbial sand, just like everybody did around the issue of safety in tower blocks up until June of last year, which led to the tragic loss of life, avoidable loss of life, in Grenfell Tower. So if you are watching this from the Fylde Peninsula, my counsel to you is to get onto your MP to look at the Freedom of Information requests that have been submitted, and you can do that by going to whatdotheyknow.com and using the search facility and search Helen Chunso or Benjamin Dean, and you can find the Freedom of Information request that they have submitted. And you know, just to give you a taste of what's to come, Benjamin Dean asked a very, very specific question. He sent a Freedom of Information request to Lancashire Fire and Rescue, and the question was, is there an evacuation plan in place for Prestonwood Road in the event of a blowout? Yes or no? And in response, he got 15 pages of gobbledygook. So I think we can take that as a no then. So people of the Fylde Peninsula, you know, it's one thing to be concerned about it, but this is now imminent. Greg Clarke has the application from Cuadrilla on his desk, and there is no emergency plan in place. There are no evacuation procedures in place. Nobody in any of the local schools knows what to do in the event of an XTO type blowout that occurred just a few months ago in Ohio. And like I said, over the next few days, we're going to be really getting into the detail of this. And I think collectively, we all need to put Greg Clarke and James Brokenshire on notice that they will be held personally accountable in the event of anything untoward occurring, because they have been given due notice. So thanks for joining me today. Sorry the view across southwest London isn't perhaps better, but nonetheless, up here on Epsom Downs this morning, I'm enjoying a little bit of peace and quiet. Unfortunately, a lot of commuter traffic around. But I will catch with you tomorrow morning at 8:30 with further information on the non-evacuation plans in place or not in place at Prestonwood Road. You have a good day.